Hey everybody, this is Roberto Blake of robertoblake.com, helping you create something awesome today. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how to start a podcast in 7 simple steps. This is my simple 7-step process for creating your own podcast. A lot of you asked me, how can you create a podcast? How do I get started? How do I get in iTunes? What hosting do I need? How much is this going to cost me? I wanted to make a video that answers those questions for you and gives you a process. I did a really short video on this before, but I want to go a little bit more in depth. The first thing you need to do is have an idea and a format for your podcast. That means you got to come up with a name for your show, a title, and you've got to figure out what the show is going to be about and whether it's going to be you solo or with a co-host or whether you're going to do interviews. So you need to figure out what your podcast is going to be and establish some kind of format. How long do you want this to be? What are you going to do in terms of topics? Are you going to have segments? You really want to create a structure for your overall show instead of fly by the seat of your pants. On the other hand, some people are really good at flying by the seat of their pants. So just figure out what works for you and establish an idea, concept, and format for your show. In my case, I open the show with an intro, then I feature and highlight an awesome creator of the day. I go into the main topic. I may or may not do a plug for something, whether it's my own thing, a sponsor, or an affiliate, and then I invite you guys to leave comments and I close out the show. That's currently my format, and on rare occasions I'll do interviews. So I'm actually still refining my format, and it's okay to do that when you're just getting started. So that's my tip number 1, my first step for launching your podcast. Step number 2 is going to be actually producing your episodes for your show. And what that's going to require is some podcast gear. In general, you're going to need audio equipment. I recommend having a decent microphone, a pop filter, and some headphones, possibly an audio mixer, but you don't really need one, just depends on what you want to do with your setup, and you need some type of audio editing software. I will do a separate video about all of this and make tons of gear recommendations, but my entire setup, both the cheap version and the expensive version, is in the description below. If push came to shove though, you could just get a pair of earbuds and you could use your iPhone and you can use the voice memo feature, and that would be good enough just to get started, or you could record directly to SoundCloud. All these are options and you don't have to make it super complicated if you just want to get started. So that's what you'll need to do. Then you need to actually produce your shows. That means you're going to need to go ahead and record your audio into your software. If you need free software, I recommend a program called Audacity. You can get that on PC and Mac. If you're a Mac user, you can use GarageBand. If you're a PC user, I highly recommend Adobe Audition. It's what I use. It's part of the Creative Cloud. So those are your audio software. You're going to want to record into those or on your smartphone. And I would recommend having 5 or 10 episodes of your podcast already done, edited, and produced before you launch the show. That way, once you go ahead and you decide to start distributing iTunes, you already have some stuff out there. You can go ahead and promote it. I would put the first 4 or 5 episodes out. This will help you get reviews and recommendations. That's going to get you into new and noteworthy and give your podcast so much more reach. You want to do that as quickly as possible. So go ahead and have 5 shows before you get this up in iTunes, and go ahead and generate some traction around it. Then maybe have a few more episodes, 3 to 5 more episodes that are just sitting in reserve so you can release those every week and not feel like you're getting behind. This will give you momentum. This will make it easy to be consistent. So that's step number 2. Go ahead and actually produce your show. Step number 3. Add metadata to your podcast. This is really important because a lot of people underestimate how important metadata is in all of their content. This is the stuff that makes your projects searchable. If you're doing a video on YouTube, this is the title, the description, and tags. When it comes to a podcast, you have something very similar, and in your audio software, this is usually something that you can go ahead and edit yourself, or once it's on your desktop, you can go ahead and edit in the properties. Sometimes, depending on where you're uploading it, like SoundCloud, you can go ahead and edit the information there, or once you're hosting this on your WordPress site, you can edit it using the Power podcast plugin from Blueberry. I think that's what it's called. I think it's called something like the PowerCast plugin. I'll link it down below, but I just call it the Blueberry plugin because that's what I know it as from back in the day. and it's going to help you fill out information about your podcast. It's going to be able to say that you're the producer and the host of the podcast. It's going to let you give titles, and it's going to also let you name the show and give a brief description. I also use the description to put show notes in, and that for me is very helpful. So those are things you can do. Really pay attention to the metadata of your podcast because it's going to help it show up in Google search. It's going to help it show up in iTunes and the other places. It's just really important. Step number 4, create the artwork and assets for your podcast. This is going to be huge because that artwork is going to help make your podcast stand out and look different. You can hire someone to do this, or you can do it yourself. Maybe you keep it simple. Maybe you use your face. Maybe you put together a very simple piece of text artwork. Just find some way to make it unique and interesting. I personally recommend hiring an artist or a designer to put this together for you. The dimensions you need for iTunes is this needs to be 1400 by 1400 pixels, and that's going to be the square that shows up to represent your podcast in terms of an image. I also recommend, though, getting some general artwork assets made for this in terms of banners for SoundCloud and for other places that take wide format banners. Maybe you put together some assets because you want to put together a Facebook page for your podcast or some other social media. These things could all be really important. And for the website that your podcast is going to be on, which you're going to need, you still might want some of these graphical assets. So go ahead and put together something like that, or hire someone to do it for you. Number 5, you're going to need web hosting and media hosting. Most people assume that they can just get a website and start uploading their podcast files there, and technically you could, but it works better if you have a media host, because if a lot of people start listening and downloading from iTunes, this could crash your website if the files are hosted there, which is why you want a separate media host. Think of it in the same way as why we upload videos to YouTube instead of to our own website and .com. A lot of people wanted to do that, but they realized it was causing problems for their website. It's the same thing with podcasts, especially if they get a little bit long, like interviews. So you'll want a media hosting company. I recommend Libsyn. I also recommend SoundCloud. There are all some free options. There is a free tier of Spreaker. I'm going to link down to my web hosting recommendations and media hosting recommendations below. But in addition to having your media host, something like Libsyn or SoundCloud or Spreaker or whoever you want to use, you're going to need a website to actually have for your podcast. In my case, I have createsomethingawesometoday.com, which is another way of distributing the podcast, another way of it being found in search, but it also gives me more control over everything, including the metadata, and it's an easy way for me to distribute to iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher Radio, TuneIn, all of those things, because you need an RSS feed to distribute. I'll get to that in the next step, but this is why you need both a web hosting company and a media hosting company. It's also going to give you more opportunities to monetize your podcast in terms of advertisements, sponsors, affiliate links, or selling your own product or service. So I know it's another expense. It doesn't have to be too expensive, but I recommend having both. Web hosting companies I recommend, if you're a podcaster, are Bluehost, and you also could consider HostGator. I'll link to those in the description below for you guys. All the resources that I'm talking about here will be linked, whether it's gear or services or other assets that you need. Distributing your podcast in iTunes. To distribute your podcast in iTunes, you're going to need to submit it. I highly recommend that by the time you do this, you have 5 episodes that are already produced and in the can. The easiest way to distribute your podcast through iTunes is to go ahead and use the Blueberry WordPress plugin on your website and use that to distribute your podcast. You're going to link your media hosting files over to this, and it's going to be able to get those every time that you upload a new one. It's going to go ahead and pull that into what's called an RSS feed, which is really simple syndication, and that's going to update to iTunes. There may be a delay on this by a few hours, a few minutes. It just depends, and you'll see that. iTunes does have to approve your podcast, and you're going to have to give them some information that allows for that, but once you're distributing to iTunes, it's the best way to get your podcast discovered and downloaded. The other reason that I recommend the Blueberry plugin for WordPress is it will give you detailed information regarding your statistics when it comes to your podcast. This is going to be really helpful when it's time to get sponsors and to make deals. So you're going to want those things. I would also say that you should distribute it beyond iTunes. You should put it in the Google Play Store. You should put it in TuneIn. You should put it in Stitcher Radio. Let people choose where they want to consume your podcast. One of the other things I would recommend about potentially hosting with Libsyn is if you pay a little bit more, they give you your own app, and you can use your own app and get people to download it and get them really engaged with your podcast. And so this could be another way to get distribution. It could be another asset for you. So don't just look at budget solutions when it comes to the hosting and the distribution side. Really think about the long game, or remember that you could always change these things down the road if your finances allow for it. So that's going to be important to keep in mind here. Distribution is going to be make or break for your podcast. Number 7, get reviews, get ratings, and promote your podcast. I highly recommend that you use social media to engage people with your podcast, ask for feedback, and that you also encourage people to review your podcast and leave ratings. This is going to be especially helpful when it comes to getting traction in iTunes, and you want to do this within the first 2 weeks that you're in iTunes as much as possible to break into new and noteworthy. When I was putting out the Create Something Awesome Today podcast, this was something I focused on heavily. So that's why I insist that you do as many episodes before you launch as possible, just because it's going to really help you with that momentum early on, and you'll have more episodes to promote. If you just decide to release one episode and then you keep doing it week after week, then you're going to close that 2-week window. You're not going to have enough there. That's why I think you start with 5 to 10 and then you start releasing multiple episodes a week to start your podcast at launch, and then you can go to a weekly format or schedule once you have that momentum in place. So just keep that in mind, and that's going to play a huge role here. I would recommend in the first few episodes that very early in those episodes, within the first 3 or 5 minutes, that you go ahead and ask people to give you feedback, number 1, and also encourage them to review and to rate in iTunes, or you can do that at the closing of your podcast. A lot of people who listen to podcasts tend to listen to the very end, as long as it's not an extraordinarily long show. So I think that you could do it at the end and get away with that if your show is maybe no more than 15 minutes. So these are things that are going to help you early on and in the long run with your podcast. I hope this helps. Those are my 7 steps for launching your podcast. I'm going to give you a bonus tip, a bonus step, if you will. Number 8, have a business and monetization strategy for how you make money on your podcast. Having a website means that you can do affiliate links. It also means you can do Google banner advertisements. And depending on where you're distributing, I use SoundCloud a lot, but I also use other places. If you're doing your show notes and you put affiliate links to the gear you're using for your podcast or books that you recommend, etc., that's a huge opportunity to make some money on your podcast prior to getting sponsors. I also recommend that if you have your own product or service or email list, you link out to that as well, and that you promote those things in your show. This is going to put you in a position to where you're making money. Also, you can use Patreon to ask people to support your show, especially since it doesn't have ads automatically in the way that a YouTube video does. I've actually shifted my Patreon strategy from YouTube to focusing exclusively on the Create Something Awesome Today podcast. So that is a model that I think will help you, especially early on when you're just getting started. Well, I hope this works for you guys in terms of a complete guide to initially launching your podcast. If you have questions, leave those in the comment section down below. Links to everything I mentioned here, tons of resources will be linked up for you guys in the description, so make sure you're checking that out. That supports the channel, that supports my podcast. If you want to check out the Create Something Awesome Today podcast, you can check it out by just doing a search in iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, and it's right there for you. Or you can go to soundcloud.com/RobertoBlake2, just like this YouTube channel, or you can go to robertoblake.com/iTunes to check out the Create Something Awesome Today podcast in iTunes. Like this video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. Check out the other awesome stuff on the channel. As always, you guys, thanks so very much for watching, and don't forget, create something awesome today. Take care.